What I'll do first is I'm going to be introducing everyone that's here. But before I do that, I'm going to talk about why we're here. The idea is that we're going to be discussing some concepts because, people say algorithms are great, but at the same time, there's also, proper issues with them, especially in the realm of algorithmic bias, which is why we figured, hey, we need to have a proper panel on ethics as well. It's becoming increasingly obvious it's a topic that we shouldn't be ignoring. And we kind of have a rock star panel, I got to say. I'm pretty stoked to have this fine group of people here. First off, I would like to introduce Lynn Lodgett. She's a postdoc researcher at the Fairness, Accountability, Transparency, and Ethics Group at Microsoft Research in Montreal. Her focus is on computational sociolinguistics, which includes NLP techniques to examine language variation on social media. And I can personally recommend folks to give the Language Technology is Power paper a read, which is a paper that she's also worked on. Definitely thought that was a good paper. Then we also have Dr. Brandeis Marshall, who's a professor of computer science in the Computer and Information Science Department at Spelman College. But, to quote her website, she's also a rebel tech educator, scholar, and practitioner. She regularly makes public appearances and is currently writing a technology book on data, algorithms, and society. She's also the founder of DataedX, an organization that's advancing data science capabilities for everyday professionals by building data equity skills for a more inclusive workspace. Finally, we have Ayodele, and I hope I pronounced it correctly, Odubela. Please say it. Okay, thank God. And we're also very happy to have her. She has a background in both communications and data science. She's currently working as a responsible AI educator at Microsoft, but she's also the founder at Ethical AI Champions, which is a consultancy firm for data-driven solutions that are trying to apply equitable methods. She's also well known for her keynotes at conferences like PyData and the Women in Analytics Summit. So, quick introduction to everyone here, and I hope everyone who's listening is excited because genuinely this is a cool group of people to talk to. Now, to get things started, there's a couple of questions that I had in mind that we would discuss first, and after that we'll give the floor to the audience who can pitch in as well. The first question that I was slightly curious about is that in my mind, there are many ethical considerations to take seriously in the realm of natural language programming. We can do things with language, and that's of course cool, but specifically, I can also imagine that there are topics of ethics that you could be most concerned with when it comes to the domain of conversational AI specifically. So, curious, are there concerns that you have for conversational AI specifically?
I can start here, if that's all right.
Please do.
I would say one of the biggest issues that does concern me is that we almost always have to rely on internet user-generated content to train these kinds of language models. And we obviously end up ingraining and encoding so many of the issues there. We've seen in-depth fairness projects that look at the sentiment involved when we're talking about different racial groups or different religious groups. That is one of the most difficult to solve because it's hard for us as researchers and as developers to parse through and attempt to remove some of the content that might be damaging. However, we rely on that, and we rely on large amounts of that kind of data to build these models, which we end up using to build conversational tools that at the end of the day are helpful. But it's difficult to identify some of the fairness-related harms that we accidentally encode.
So would you super enthusiastic cosign to that. Sorry, Vince, if you wanted to.
No, go ahead. I'm here to support you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a downer because I think for me, the better question would be what kinds of issues aren't you worried about? Because there's very little that I'm not worried about. So, I mean, I think in general, we need a much better understanding of the nature of harms that can arise from conversational AI and language technology more general. I think performance disparities, which is sometimes the only diagnosis that we have available to us, it can only tell us so much about who's actually harmed and how. For conversational AI, I worry a lot about the costs of using systems, how the cost of using systems are distributed across groups of people, what costs some people incur when they're trying to use a system that others might not. For example, if your language variety is not recognized, or you have to accommodate to a different variety to make it work, right? Or as Adele was talking about, like what kinds of harmful stereotypes do systems reproduce, or harmful ideas about whose language is correct or understandable, right, get reproduced. How do systems get used in service of disinformation? What are the environmental costs of training expensive systems, and how are they distributed? I think in general, we have not, as a field, done a really good job of mapping out these impacts. We don't even understand kind of where they land and who is harmed, like quite concretely, like what the material costs of these things are. So yeah, maybe that was not a very cheerful way to start the conversation, but I worry a lot.
No, there's a lot to worry about, right? I mean, because even in both of your responses, you were talking about harms, but yet harms is very much based upon who is the receiver of that language. And so a harm to you may not be a harm to me. And so how do you capture that duality and that complexity, right? And I think that is why conversational AI is so nuanced and so tricky, is because it can't really be automated, because a system can only understand a particular path. But what happens with harms is that there are multiple paths. There's multiple outcomes that could happen, and the harms themselves are not the same based upon a community. So just because it's harmful, let's say, to the Asian community, it might also be harmful to, let's say, the Muslim community. But those harms could be very different. They could be expressed differently in the language models, in how they're being perceived. And so any of the remedies or any of the implications cannot be mapped out in concise pattern recognition style ways.
Yeah.
So it's very complicated. It's a very complicated, and the tech community trying to retrofit everything into a pattern or into an algo is problematic, just in general. I'm just going to throw that in the ring because I'm ready to get in it. Let's just say there's certain things that tech just should not be doing. And maybe this is something that tech needs to just kind of step away for a second and take a pause for cause.
I think if there's anything we have learned, it's just language is hard, and social context is really hard, and that the drive to generate solutions that are sort abstract and divorced from particular contexts, and that work for all solutions, and that we must develop a super technical solution that works the same way for everybody, is itself going to incur harms. And I think you're totally right that we haven't really thought through that yet. We're just pushing too hard.
I think it's led us to settle for solutions which come along the lines of prioritize the most marginalized, because we have a difficulty talking about this nuance, and a lot of organizations would like expert systems and outlined rules, but it is incredibly difficult and nearly impossible without getting into where we weigh groups of people. Do we find X group more important than Y group, and therefore we prioritize them? And it is so difficult for us to do that in a technical perspective that so much of the recommendations have been, maybe we don't do that, or maybe there are ways to avoid the system or not use specific systems, so that because we aren't capable and we're not great at being able to discuss the nuance when it comes to harm specifically.
So this is actually a nice little introduction to the second question that I had in mind. It's also something that I've noticed personally. When you're taught to think very technical about a problem, then all the solutions that you come up with are also very technical. And a thing that I've noticed myself is that it's maybe better to let the technical bits go and sort of say this is not a quantitative problem, it's more of a qualitative problem. So sort of take a step back from assuming that the algorithm is going to solve all of this. Now, that said, there's a lot of effort in machine learning techniques to try to mitigate bias. I wonder, would you agree that this is still a worthwhile pursuit? Or would you say, well, at this point, there's definitely better avenues to consider if we're interested in making AI more ethical?
I'm going to jump in. So I think this is a tough question because it is doing a tech thing, which is a binary approach. It's either one or the other. And in fact, there's so much in the spectrum that's in the middle. And what's in the middle is the political, the economic, the social nuances that get removed from this notion of how to deal with bias, how to consider whether or not to move forward with machine learning approaches or not. Because even the qualitative approaches inside of tech that I've seen are still more, the qualitative approaches that I've seen used in tech are still very quantitative. And so I think there needs to be an introduction and infusion of more people from the humanist side who are, social sciences in order to really have a fuller conversation about whether or not a machine learning style solution is even a good approach. And then we need to talk through the layers and the intersections of the political, economic, and the social impacts and influences, because we don't talk about that, right? So I will speak for myself. As a Black woman, there are many spaces where I'm not counted, or I'm double counted, or I'm triple counted, right? I'm counted as a woman, I'm counted as Black, I'm counted as American, right? So it just depends on the system, but we don't talk about how my full self or my whole self never get a 360 view. And I think a lot of non-white, men identifying individuals have the exact same experience, but we don't talk about that. And the tech systems don't incorporate that framing at all. And they're trying to figure it out via tech solutions, qualitative or quantitative, but none of the solutions include my intersectionality and the intersectionality of many other people. All right, I'm off my soapbox. Someone else go.
I have a soapbox. I have a lot of thoughts about this. I think, first of all, I think in order for a mitigation approach to be effective, you first have to know what harm you're trying to mitigate. And I think, otherwise at best, right, these, so-called bias mitigation approaches where it will be pretty poorly matched to the actual harm and ineffective, and at worst, they'll actually exacerbate the issue or cause other harms that you didn't anticipate. So I think coming back to the first question, right, before we try to develop fixes, we should have a much, much better understanding of the nature of harms that actually occur, right, what the impacts of these systems are. Otherwise, technical fixes will certainly, they might be premature or not appropriate anyway, but they'll certainly be premature and not appropriate. I think another thing is that mitigation approaches assume that we know what the solution ought to be, right? Like as soon as you're in the business of developing a solution, there's an implicit assumption that you know what the wrong system behavior is and that you know what the right system behavior is. But these are hard, like inherently social or normative questions, right? They're not technical questions. And we haven't really started to have these conversations about them as a community. So just thinking about conversational agents, just trying to, narrow it down a little bit to conversational agents, I'm thinking like, what do we want a conversational agent? What language do we want an agent to produce, right? Should it always be polite? Should it treat all dialects and languages exactly the same, or should it vary its response? Should it use reclaimed slurs or linguistic features associated with different minorized varieties? What topics should it avoid or respond to? Like all of these things are like social and normative questions. And I don't know that we can make progress on mitigation approaches before we have collective conversations on what systems should do at all. And it's not something that we have even begun to want to negotiate explicitly, right? And I think any solution that any solution will make some of these decisions implicitly, and I think that is very, very dangerous. And so we have to think have very frank conversations about these things. And it might be that we don't all agree, right? I think dissensus is probably to be expected because language is contextual and hard, and we will probably all there will be disagreement on like what this piece of language means or whether it's appropriate, and we have to figure out kind of processes for negotiating that dissensus, and because it can be very generative. I think the last part of the soapbox is I think that we are often too quick to jump on mitigation approaches without inspecting like the full pipeline. I think undesirable outcomes can happen because of any number of decisions that we made, right? A problem formulation, because when we decide which users or languages or use cases we're serving, or data collection, because process of data collection deserves more attention, at evaluation time, because we've chosen some metrics and that has effect. The metrics we choose have some effects, right? So I think in general, rather than jumping to a machine learning solution, we should spend time interrogating all of these choices. And there are really good resources for doing so. And we can maybe spend more time later talking about what some of those like resources are. But in general, I'm a big fan of kind of interrogating all of our choices before jumping to like a machine learning solution.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of that, I think it's huge that we not attempt to mitigate these harms without being able to truly identify them. And I think that is where so much of the work and research is still on and is still ongoing before we're able to then create a solution that it helps us mitigate them. But it also requires us to ask a little bit deeper, what do we mean by bias? I've done talks on this, but I'm like, do people, when I say the word bias, do people think societal biases? Do engineers think statistical bias? Do ML engineers think simply bias as we're talking about neural networks? So becoming more specific, I think we truly mean fairness-related harms, but even in that, even with that wording, bias and these fairness-related harms can happen at any point in building systems. So it can be in the data, it can be in engineer choice, it can be in how the system is developed and under what use cases. If this is for surveillance or if this is for public benefit, makes a massive difference, even if we're using very similar technology. So trying to be more specific about what we mean. If we want to mitigate how biases show up in systems by all of the non-data aspects, so parts of the engineering process, there are some things we can do there, but they're not going to be complete solutions until we start working with social scientists and working on a socio-technical level and not just the technical level, which is where all of my fears are, and that teams put it on themselves to try and learn the cultural nuance and try and build perfect product and solutions, but they're unable to. We're unable to build really sufficiently decent products because we tend to work in really insulated engineering groups and not involve any social scientists or involve really anyone on those social science. It's not just social scientists. There's UX researchers. There are so many policy analysts, so many people involved that need to be involved in how we shape this technology. And it's not that mitigation isn't worthwhile. I don't think we're there without proper ways to try and identify these issues to begin with.
I mean, I want to piggyback off of what Ardeli said. The very end, you were talking about how there is this like need in order to make a decision of where to go. Like, do we have this technical solution, you're fearful of it not being social technical, but there is also this thread I want to pull, which is tech is always trying to move fast and break things. And this whole notion is just irritates my spirit because what are we moving fast for? And what are we breaking? And since we are breaking things, how are we actually fixing them? And so this whole thought path of tech and the way it's been narrated is problematic because it is dehumanizing. And what we're saying, I think all three of us, is like, humans need to be in every single place. And that does mean that it will take more time. We have to be more thoughtful. We have to be more insightful. It is necessary. There is no plan for that. There is no app for that. There is no data set for that. It is a matter of having conversations and looking at case by case basis and understanding what we're dealing with versus trying to skirt over the problem and then just provide a half-baked, half-cocked solution that's supposed to be, quote, perfect. But once a harm is revealed, oh, we can just make an update. We can just do a software patch and it'll be better the next time around. And this notion of software patches is the attempt in order to cover the harms that have happened. But they never quite get there because they don't think about it at the inception. So why don't we try looking at the software development lifecycle, that planning phase that y'all always want to skip? Why don't y'all spend more time there? So then when you get to the implementation and deployment phase, you won't have all these mess ups. And I didn't want to say mess ups, but I understand the audience.
And sometimes the solution is just not to build the thing, right? Or not to deploy it. Like sometimes it's just not... And it's way better to do that than to be like, oops, we messed up.
and I think a good point here, too, is that there have been so many of these mess ups, right? What I would like to see these orgs do is at least take the step to provide recourse or remediation instead of offering a software patch as a consolation for those who have already been harmed. We tend to gloss over what has happened and say, oh, well, for the next group of users, we are a little bit better and not, again, addressing the social. Like there are people who are going to see tangible harm and tangible negative impacts on their life depending on the technology. We have to do more than just say, oh, well, we fixed it in the next version. That's, I think, unfortunately, one of the biggest issues I see in AI is that we have developed this out of software. And that has determined every methodology we've used to understand and critique AI systems is with the same lens of this is just another piece of software. And that the biggest issue is that it erases the entire social aspect and that it is drastically more impactful and more scalable and also more high stakes than the vast majority of software that we create.
I like the criticism of move fast and break things. I certainly think move slow and fix things is easily a better attitude to have. I really like this discussion, but there's a third question I'm just kind of dying to hear your opinion on. Because when it comes to ethics in AI, I mean, there's been plenty of examples of things that have gone wrong. Like, just open any newspaper these days. However, I am curious, from your perspective, has there also been a major milestone in the last 2 years in the sense that can we maybe speak of a success story as well? Is there anything that maybe gives you hope or something that makes you think, well, that deserves recognition because that's actually a major milestone in a good direction?
I will say one thing, and I think it's mostly on the regulation side. I have seen a lot of larger organizations start this push for regulation that would regulate them, specifically in AI, but not only, I think it's very obvious, most Americans agree we need at minimum a GDPR or similar here, but at least I've seen some orgs that are really pushing for adequate regulation that would also provide them with certain levels of accountability. But that's one of the things that I don't think I entirely expected is that they are, instead of pushing against regulation, also looking for it.
Brandon, you want to jump in or
oh, go, sorry, yes. Do go ahead. Feel free.
Well, the success stories are, I think, pretty sparse, but I do think, right, like I think anti-facial recognition legislation has become a thing in some places, and that it's exciting. Of course, that happened because of pioneering work by Black women scholars and also by advocates on the ground, right? So a lot of of movement and really hard work. But seeing that legislation kind of pop up in places and get pushed through, even in kind of like in scattered places in the US, I think has been really heartening. I think these issues have come into kind of public awareness a lot more in the last few years. Sometimes the way that happens is not good. It's like, and we can all probably think of a few examples. But kind of the way, for example, the like large language models have entered public awareness as like something to focus on. I think even though like the way that happened is awful, the fact that like these things are making headlines and are like part of the public consciousness, and I've seen public discourse on them in a way that I had never seen before, is somewhat heartening.
I think the only thing that I would add is on the more educational front is that there's a lot more that I see in the educational space at the higher ed level of people trying to understand the nature of work when it comes to computing, AI, and data science. There is a push from learners in order to understand what's the impact of what they're building. And that is something that in the past 2 years, I've really seen a surge. But yeah, as the other panelists has mentioned, the goodness of AI, those are very sparse. I'm sitting here trying to think of one that did not have its origins in a harm revealing display. And everyone I'm thinking of, there was harm that happened before there was the good. But of course, the AI for good or anything for good notion is another point of contention that I have.
Should we talk about that?
Let's go ahead and jump into that.
You're more than certainly feel free to.
Anything that I hear that is for good, I'm like,
oh gosh, yeah.
So it's centering white people again.
Yeah,
and I'm like, well, that's not for me. I do that all the time, so I don't need to do for good.
And I think if we're looking at if we are being realistic, we do also have to address one of the big elephants in the room, and it's been talked about, is this whole idea of diversity in AI, how we just make a team more diverse and we'll have better products. While a small part of me agrees with that, we have to understand that we still operate within these very large systems, and kind of addressing one of the comments, there are few incentive structures and there are few aspects of our current tech system that incentivize this kind of work, that incentivize working with contractors and working with people who are more specialized. There are few ways that we genuinely center that. So when we do build tools that are for social good, we tend to want to investigate not only who the team is, but who they centered. Like I mentioned, we do have to start making choices about which groups of people we understand, because of historical context, are more marginalized than others, and then place our value priorities to suit the most marginalized or the most erased groups. So I 100% agree with you, Brandeis. There are so many avenues that we say, hey, we are using this AI to build this specific good thing, when what we're looking for as researchers, people who are critiquing this, is I want to see how you actually planned through this project. Prove to me that it's for good and not just for good of the dominant groups, which is who we almost always center when we're building technology. And I think having an understanding that almost every product that we build, almost every new piece of hardware is tested on and specifically targeting a specific group of people, as much as we say we make projects for everyone. But that group of people is almost always everyone in the dominant culture. So once we're able to truly acknowledge that, I think we'll start to separate this notion of for good, meaning ethics washing whatever our product is in order to drum up positive sentiment and PR around us. But I think shifting that towards both, I hate the word ethics, but I think starting to think about things more equitably, thinking about equitable methodologies that don't just provide equal outcomes depending on whatever group or intersectional group you're in, but providing adequate responses based on what we've seen historically. So I think there's also going to be a huge shift away from this ethics and from for good into, are we living up to what consumers expect as far as what is equitable and what is the right thing to do? And I think that it is a difficult conversation, and organizations have a tough time really setting these ethical frameworks and saying, this is where we stand, and this is the perspective we're going to take with building all featured products. And not just, we built one thing that's kind of in our massive sphere that we can say is more equitable or for good, but we also still provide products and services for ICE, other organizations. Being able to come to that point is not going to be easy, because it is easier to just, use words like for good and ethical to make things appear as if they don't harm people, without actually investigating the harms that those products and services can cause to you.
Yep, for sure. Yeah, and I'll add, I guess, two things piggybacking off of that. One is that, often the dynamic becomes we will add minoritized people to the team and make the fairness stuff their job.
Yes!
They know that fairness stuff. And then, and not actually rethinking your entire practice or whatever, right? But and so now you've now nicely compartmentalized it and then made it somebody else's job, and as though they need to be the only people who needs to know about anything, right? Or do any research or interact with people who might be affected.
Or they're the experts in it.
They're the experts. They know everything. They're there to know. You don't need to do it. You don't need to do anything. Yeah. And I think the other thing is that I think I do find myself increasingly worried about these, or interested in thinking about these organizational dynamics and incentive structures, because it's not like there haven't been kind of frameworks emerging for thinking about these things. We have data sheets for data sets and model cards for model reporting, and people have we're not finished, but people have produced really brilliant frameworks for thinking about and communicating these things and making transparent our processes and thinking through slowing down our work. But that doesn't mean anything if organizations don't actually shift incentives such that this is a thing that you're prepared to do. And it's really hard, against product deadlines, to do these things without these kind of incentives. So I think, and frankly, it's also really hard kind of translating from academic work on, here's how you measure bias to really this is how, this is how, harms arise in this particular language setting for this particular task and this deployment setting, the set of users and so on. It's really hard to do that. And without organizational support, I think it's pretty impossible to make use of any of the knowledge that we have.
Yeah. It always goes back to capitalism.
It does. Our incentives, they 100% drive how we've built technology and how teams operate within it.
So there's a couple of people asking questions, but I do want to admit, I do appreciate the blunt honesty. So having said that, so there are people listening who are building digital assistants, and this might also be a nice moment to sort of tell this group of people hey, look, if you're going to take this serious, here's the thing I just want you to know. Any other blunt, honest feedback that comes to mind? And again, feel free. I'm certainly appreciating it.
I would say first and foremost, weigh the potential benefit against the potential harm. And while you might not be able to see all of the potential harms, that's okay, but truly work with those that have historical context or have studied this deeply. It is not the responsibility of engineers to understand every single way this can go wrong. It's the responsibility of engineers to work with people who are at least able to shed more light or have more knowledge there. And that I would say is my biggest piece of advice, is to work with not just non-technical folks, but people who have studied the impact of tech on society. It's not, the expectation is not for you to be perfect, and that's okay. The expectation is that you are able to understand where you don't have depth or you don't have a ton of knowledge. And I say this all the time. I didn't study social scientists. I have facial recognition that doesn't work for me. It's not because I've spent years of my life researching this. And again, I have 1.5 million areas where I'm not able to see bias systems. So don't just rely on like marginalized people and hope that they are able to extrapolate or highlight everything that can impact marginalized groups. But don't fear about working with contractors or people outside of your technical organization.
Yeah, and piggyback off of that, I think one thing that makes it hard to get organizational support or investment in these kinds of things is just like convincing like senior folks, often like how many unknown unknowns there are, right? Like, and how hard this problem is, and how much you can't rely on your gut intuitions, and like how much thinking has been developed out there, right? There are like very like entire huge robust fields that have been thinking about these issues very deeply, some for a very long time, and you need and so I don't really know like what the answer is for folks trying to convince more senior people. Like, these are all the things that we know that we know that we don't know, and there's more things that we don't even know that we don't know, but we need to invest, right, to figure that out. And I don't really know what the answer to that problem is, right? How to convince people that there are enough unknown unknowns that you have to like take the time and invest. But that strikes me as like a very kind of fundamental barrier to putting sincere effort into mapping out these harms.
Yeah. I think the only thing that I would have to add is get outside of your comfort zone regularly, right? So for me, it was reading different literatures from social scientists. It was really looking at Black feminist theory and a lot of Black femmes that really have been thinking deeply about this work. Some critical race theory. I did a couple years ago. Before that, I was doing culturally responsive teaching, understanding that. So really looking outside of my wheelhouse within computing, and then talking with others on a regular basis. As you are technically sound and building that technical prowess, be just as diligent in understanding the social, political, economic impacts of the work that you do as well. Again, not to be perfect, but just to be aware so that you can be a better practitioner, a better developer, a better, tech citizen, really, because that is the role, because that is what you're doing. What you're doing is going out to millions or billions of people. And so that type of work requires you to always be learning, and not just learning inside the tech space, but also learning at the impacts of that tech. So that's my offer to you. And I enjoy sitting around and talking to people who do not have the same background I do. I enjoy it quite thoroughly because I learn something new, and then I go, oh, I never thought about it that way. I wonder how that impacts that. And they're like, oh, we didn't understand that part of tech. And then it becomes this ecosystem of understanding, and the harms that you cannot fathom, all of a sudden they become more easy for you to tease out when you're in that room trying to code something with the team. You go, oh, this could happen and that could happen, right? So for accessibility, just try turning off the audio and see what happens. Just try turning off the video and see how that product works. Yes, they're hokey, but try it. and see what happens. It's a completely different level of sensory input, and it provides you a different perspective that's very necessary.
The last thing I'd love to just throw in here is specifically for stakeholders, C-suite people. If AI or machine learning even is a part of your product, is a major part of your engineering because you think that is going to be a large part of your product, the best thing you can do early on is tie your, whether it's KPIs, tie your any kind of tangible measurement and actually use that to tie stakeholder or management raises and promotions and actually embedding fairness, being able to say that we have actually taken positive steps and we were here and now we are actually better. Having that be an organizational goal is one of the best things you can do, even if you can't work with synthetic data and attempt to achieve better data representativeness. At least embed those ideas into the foundation of your organization so that when your CTOs and your technical teams are starting to look at the work they've done, they don't overlook fairness and just say, if you have time, we'll get to it. But if that is a huge tenet of your organization, they'll actually work to optimize for that. And while there's lots of imperfections there, it's still better to lay the groundwork for potentially for this being embedded in your org's goals from the beginning than to attempt to address it later when we don't have time in our product management workflow. We don't have PMs that understand enough to give developers time to do this. So making it something that, as an entire organization, is a priority is going to be helpful.
We are nearing the end of our allotted time, but thank you. I definitely appreciate all the honesty. Always do that whenever you're speaking. That's always good. I've made lots of notes for myself personally. So once again, Sulin, Brandeis, and Ayodele, thank you for being here and sharing your ideas.